Greetings, dear traveller, and welcome to this quiet space of history. Before we embark on our journey through the bitterly cold winters of medieval Europe, I want to extend a heartfelt welcome to you, whether you're snuggled up in your bed, ready to drift off into peaceful slumber, or simply seeking a moment of calm with some soothing historical storytelling. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. If you feel like sharing, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Please leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a joy to see the diverse community of history enthusiasts coming together here. And if you enjoy this immersive, calming journey into the past, don't forget to click that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Now, let's leave the modern world behind and travel back to a time when winter held a far fiercer grip on survival. A time when the changing of the seasons meant far more than simply pulling out your winter coat. Imagine yourself standing in the countryside of medieval Europe. The last leaves have long since fallen, leaving the trees bare against the pale sky. The sun hangs low, its feeble rays offering little warmth as the icy air bites at your skin. With each step, the frost beneath your feet cracks sharply. The first snowflakes are beginning to drift down, marking the arrival of winter. For the people of this time, winter was not a season to look forward to. It wasn't simply a cold spell to endure, it was a harsh reality that could mean the difference between life and death. The cold creeps in gradually at first, but it soon settles in for long, agonising months, its icy grip holding tight. The land will soon be covered in snow, and the rivers and ponds will freeze into glistening sheets of ice. In a time before central heating and insulated homes, warmth was a rare luxury, afforded only to the wealthiest. But it wasn't always like this. Medieval winters hadn't always been so unforgiving. There was a time when the seasons followed a more predictable rhythm. The arrival of snow, while still a challenge, was met with an understanding that it would pass, as it always had. People could rely on the steady change of the seasons. However, something began to shift, and the climate itself started to change. This marked the beginning of what would later come to be known as the Little Ice Age. Spanning from the 14th century into the 19th century, the Little Ice Age brought much colder temperatures, longer winters, and unpredictable weather that had never been experienced before. Though the precise reasons for this dramatic shift are still debated, its effects were felt across the land. Crops failed, livestock perished, and the cold winds seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. One of the most famous and terrifying examples of this climate shift was the Great Frost of 1709. That year, temperatures plummeted to record lows, and the world seemed to freeze. Rivers and lakes turned to solid ice, and in London, the River Thames was frozen over so completely that it became a frozen marketplace. People set up stalls on the ice, selling goods, cooking food, and even lighting fires right there in the middle of the river. It was a strange and surreal scene, but it came at a tragic price. Many people died that winter, unable to survive the freezing temperatures. Their homes, no matter how well stocked, couldn't protect them from the intense cold. Yet, in the midst of all this suffering, some individuals found unexpected solace in the winter's bitter embrace. One such person was Isaac Newton, the young student at Cambridge University. When the frost hit, Newton was forced to return home to his family's farm. There, in the quiet of his surroundings, he was afforded the time to think and reflect deeply. With the fires of the farm burning brightly, Newton, isolated from his usual academic duties, turned his mind to the mysteries of the universe. It was during this winter retreat that he began developing his theories on calculus and optics, ideas that would eventually change the course of science. Who knows what other minds in similar isolation might have been similarly inspired by the solitude and stillness of the harsh winter? It's a poignant reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit is capable of seeking out light. And for Newton, the chill of winter didn't represent just coldness. It was the very catalyst for some of his most significant discoveries. However, for the vast majority of medieval people, winter was not a time of reflection or growth, it was a time of survival. The wealthier classes could afford woolen garments, well-stocked fireplaces, and ample food stores to see them through the long lean months. But for the peasants, the serfs, and the working poor, the winter months were a struggle of a different kind. Picture yourself waking up in a humble, smoke-filled cottage. The air is thick with the stench of the fire that barely keeps the cold at bay. You rise from your straw bed, careful not to disturb your family members huddled together for warmth. Your breath forms clouds in front of your face, and the icy chill of the room sinks deep into your bones. If you're lucky, Breakfast might be a meagre bowl of porridge or some stale bread left over from the harvest. But those food stores are running low, and you know that with each passing day they will dwindle even further. The winter has a way of gnawing at your hope, just as it gnaws at the body, making each day a fight for survival. The livestock, too, are suffering. Their coats matted with frost, they huddle together in the barn, their breath rising in visible clouds as they try to stay warm. The barn itself offers little protection, with drafts seeping in through the cracks in the wood. Each day you venture out into the snow to gather firewood, knowing full well that without a fire, your family will not survive the night. The work is back-breaking, and your hands quickly become raw and chapped, but it must be done. You think of your children, their faces pinched with hunger and cold, and you press on knowing that their survival depends on your efforts. This was the harsh reality for so many medieval people. Winter didn't just make life uncomfortable, it made it a battle, a constant struggle against the elements that consumed every waking hour. The frigid cold didn't take a holiday. It was always there, lurking just beyond the safety of the hearth. But even amid this hardship, there were moments of resilience, moments where the human spirit found a way to endure. The medieval world was deeply in tune with the cycles of nature, and the passing seasons were marked by more than just the weather. They were part of a rich tapestry of traditions, celebrations and rituals that helped the people survive emotionally, even when their physical endurance was tested to the limit. Imagine the warmth of a community gathered together in a barn, sharing what little they had: food, warmth, stories. Despite the cold and hunger, these moments of connection were the thread that held them together. The medieval world may have been harsh and unforgiving, but it was also one in which people found ways to share their strength, their resilience, and their hope. So as you sit here tonight, safe and warm, remember those who lived through the bitter winters of medieval Europe. And as we continue to travel through history together, remember that even in the coldest, darkest times, the human spirit endures, finds ways to thrive, and even discovers greatness. Even amidst the icy grip of winter, there were brief moments of warmth and light. One such moment was the midwinter feast of St. Stephen, held annually on December 26th. For a brief magical day, the rigid social hierarchies that defined medieval life were turned upside down. A peasant or serf was chosen as the Lord of Misrule for the day, crowned to oversee a wild celebration filled with food, drink and merriment. This rare moment of indulgence allowed people to forget the hard, cold days of their lives, even if only for a short time. It was a fleeting but powerful reminder that for a few hours, the rigid rules of society could be temporarily set aside in favour of joy and revelry. Yet perhaps the most enduring symbol of hope during the medieval winter was the simple yet profound act of togetherness. In a world where survival often depended on the strength of one's community, the bonds of family and friendship became essential for enduring the harshest seasons. Picture, if you will, a small village blanketed in snow. The smoke rising from chimneys is a welcome sign of life amid the barren landscape. Inside the homes, families huddle together around the warmth of the hearth. They share stories, passing down traditions, and offering what little food they have. Despite the scarcity, there is a deep sense of unity here, a collective spirit determined to survive the cold together. Neighbours trudge through the snow to check on each other, bringing extra firewood, a warm blanket, or a pot of stew. Faces, though weary, glow with quiet resolve. They have faced winter's wrath before, and they know that despite the hunger and the cold, they will endure it again. It's in these small acts of kindness and solidarity that the heart of medieval communities lay. They may have been surrounded by snow, ice and isolation, but they were never truly alone. As the cold months stretched on, the snow piled higher, the ice grew thicker, and the biting winds never seemed to stop. But no matter how harsh the winter, the people of medieval Europe knew one thing for certain: spring would come. With keen eyes, they watched for signs of its arrival, the slight lengthening of the days, the softening of the earth beneath the snow. And when the first whispers of spring appeared, it was met with an unparalleled sense of joy. They celebrated the arrival of the new season as we might celebrate a long-awaited reunion. Plough. Monday, marking the official end of winter, was a day of great significance. After months of cold and scarcity, it marked the moment when work in the fields could finally resume. The ploughs, which had been idle and covered in snow, were brought out of storage and ceremoniously blessed. The act of ploughing was not just about preparing the land for planting. It was a powerful symbol of the rebirth of the earth, of new life pushing through the hard winter soil. When the first furrows were cut into the earth, there was a palpable sense of relief, even gratitude. The long months of hunger and cold were finally behind them, and with the plough they renewed their connection to the land and to life itself. It's almost impossible to fully comprehend the resilience of people living through such relentless hardship. The idea of facing the same trials year after year, with little relief, seems unimaginable in our modern world of comfort and convenience. Yet there is something profoundly humbling about realising that our ancestors, year after year, survived such hardships. They weathered winters of incredible brutality, with the odds stacked against them, and yet they found ways to endure. Through every snowstorm, every hunger pang, and every freezing night, they clung to the belief that spring would always follow winter. In a world that often feels far removed from the trials of medieval life, we are left with a legacy of resilience. Our ancestors found hope in the darkest of times, in the simplest things: a warm meal, a shared story, the first thaw of the earth. This legacy has been passed down to us, and is something we should cherish. So the next time you find yourself shivering on a cold winter's day, take a moment to think of those who lived through winters far harsher than anything we face today. Think of their struggles, their joys and their triumphs, and above all remember the strength of the human spirit that carried them through. And when the cold winds howl outside, let it be a reminder of the unbreakable resilience of those who came before us. The promise of spring, as certain as the turning of the seasons, is always there, waiting just beyond the horizon. But the hardships of winter were not reserved solely for the poor and the common folk. Even the highest of nobility were not spared from the cruel embrace of winter. For the royal families living in medieval castles, winter brought its own set of trials. While castles might have been grand, they were often poorly equipped to handle the severity of the cold. Draughts seeped through the stone walls, and the great halls, though imposing, were often bitterly cold. Maintaining a royal residence through the winter months was no small feat. Vast amounts of firewood had to be stockpiled to keep the fires burning, and kitchen staff worked tirelessly to preserve food for the long months ahead. Servants worked around the clock to seal every gap, every crack, to prevent the cold from seeping into the royal chambers. Despite their best efforts, the harsh winter still took its toll. In one particularly tragic story, a medieval queen is said to have perished from exposure within her very own palace, despite the grandeur and wealth that surrounded her. Even in the face of such wealth, no one was truly safe from the ruthless grip of winter. This stark contrast between the elite and the common people underscores a crucial truth. Winter in medieval times was a force of nature that no amount of wealth or privilege could fully protect against. Whether you lived in a humble cottage or a grand castle, you were at the mercy of the season's ferocity. The cold was a great equalizer, reminding everyone, no matter their station, of the true power of nature. According to chroniclers, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary met a tragic fate one bitter January morning in 1326. She was found frozen in her bed, a victim of the very castle that was meant to protect her. This grim story serves as a harsh reminder that in the darkest depths of winter, even the most protected were vulnerable to the cold's merciless grasp. Yet amid such tragedies, the resilience of the human spirit endured, always finding reasons to rekindle hope. For many in medieval society, that faint glimmer of hope came with the feast of St. Stephen, celebrated each year on December 26th. This midwinter celebration offered a brief respite from the daily grind and hardships of peasant life, a rare sanctioned opportunity for indulgence and revelry. Central to the feast was the tradition of misrule, a playful inversion of the social order. On this single day, a commoner was chosen to be the Lord of Misrule, granted temporary authority to oversee the celebrations, issue amusing edicts, and command the festivities. Though this reversal of power was brief, it provided a crucial outlet for the simmering frustrations of the peasantry. For one day, the rigid lines of feudal society blurred and all could partake equally in the revelry, the games, and the abundant food and drink. This light-hearted act of rebellion was far more than a mere diversion. It was an essential release valve for the tensions built up by the oppressive hierarchy. In a world where the wealthy lorded over the labouring masses, even a temporary taste of equality was a powerful balm. It allowed people to feel free, if only for a few hours, and reminded them of their shared humanity. This act of joy, however fleeting, was a vital tool for sustaining morale through the bleakest days of winter. It reinforced the sense of community that was so essential to survival. The bonds of fellowship forged during such feasts helped sustain the medieval population through the harshest times. In an age of scarcity, compassion was often the thin line between life and death. One account from 1377 tells of two peasant families, neighbours who had long since exhausted their winter stores. Facing the very real prospect of starving before the arrival of spring, they pooled their last remaining resources to share a humble meal on St. Stephen's Day. That simple act of generosity, of coming together in shared adversity, gave them the strength to face the remainder of the winter's brutal trials. In the face of such hardships, moments of compassion became the cornerstone of medieval society. A hand offered to a frostbitten traveller, an extra log shared with a shivering widow, these small gestures of kindness made all the difference. Even though medieval life was often cruel and unforgiving, these acts of mutual support forged an unspoken contract of interdependence. The reality of surviving winter together made people more reliant on one another, transcending the rigid social structures of the time. But even the warmest expressions of fellowship couldn't stave off the inevitable cold. The Feast of St. Stephen was a fleeting flare of light in the otherwise freezing darkness. After the merriment of December 26th passed, the long slog of January, February and March would take over. Stores of food dwindled, hunger began to gnaw at the bellies, and the cold continued to seep in, no matter how much firewood was piled on the hearth. For the peasants, the promise of spring seemed like an impossible dream as winter wore on. And yet, year after year, medieval society endured. Through unimaginable suffering, they clung to survival, sustained by their grit, their community, and the faintest glimmer of hope that one day the cold would break. And when that day arrived, it was met with a relief so profound it could only be described as miraculous. The first signs of winter's end were watched for eagerly. The softening of the air, the lengthening of daylight, and the slow drip of icicles as the sun's rays grew stronger. After months of relentless cold, these subtle signs were enough to ignite hope in even the most battle-weary hearts. For those whose lives depended on the earth, the arrival of Plough Monday marked the first true sign of spring's arrival. Falling on the first Monday after Epiphany, it was a day when the agricultural year began anew. While winter still held a firm grip on the land, the preparations for Plough Monday served as a promise that the season would eventually loosen its hold. The ploughs, which had sat idle during the cold months, were brought out and ceremoniously blessed. The first furrows of the earth were carved not just as an agricultural task, but as an act of defiance against winter itself. With each furrow turned, the people of medieval Europe demonstrated their tenacity, refusing to let the cold extinguish their spirits. They knew that with spring's return, life would begin anew. In our modern world, where warmth and comfort are easily accessible, it's hard to imagine the incredible fortitude required to survive a medieval winter. We grumble about the slightest inconveniences, delayed flights, traffic snarls, or the occasional cold snap. Yet compared to the relentless brutality of a medieval winter, these complaints seem insignificant. Our ancestors faced cold, hunger, and isolation for months at a time, relying on little more than their resilience and the strength of their communities to survive. To imagine the suffering they endured and still manage to find moments of joy and celebration is humbling. These medieval people were true survivors, not just because they endured, but because they found ways to live fully even in the darkest times. They leaned on each other, found joy in small things, and kept their hope alive, no matter how bleak their circumstances seemed. So next time we find ourselves frustrated by the trivial inconveniences of modern life, it might be worth taking a moment to reflect on the incredible resilience of those who came before us. Let their ability to find joy and strength in the most trying of circumstances inspire us to tap into our own reservoirs of fortitude. As we settle into the warmth of our homes, safe from the cold, let us remember the struggles of our ancestors, those who fought winter's cruel siege with nothing but willpower, community, and hope. When the ploughing rituals faded into memory and the frigid winter days returned to their usual rhythm, life in medieval Europe settled into its familiar pattern. For the wealthy, winter meant a retreat into the warmth of drafty, smoky homes. For the less fortunate, it meant a constant struggle against the elements, one they had to face every year. And yet, through it all, they carried on, driven by the unyielding promise that one day spring would return. One of the greatest hardships of winter in medieval times was the constant threat of sickness. In the cramped, unsanitary living conditions of the time, disease spread quickly, often faster than the cold could chill the bones. The common cold, though common, was a misery in its own right, leaving those afflicted with red noses and blurry eyes, struggling to carry on with their daily tasks. But the true dangers lay in more serious illnesses that haunted the populace. Influenza, for example, could strike down both young and old, sweeping through communities with its fever, chills, and aches. Without the protection of vaccines or effective treatments, flu outbreaks had the potential to devastate entire towns. The winter of 1557 saw one of the deadliest strains of influenza ravaging Europe. In Paris alone, over 10,000 people died from the disease, a stark reminder of the ever-present threat of illness in a time of limited medical knowledge. Pneumonia was another stealthy killer that lurked in the shadows. The cold, damp air of winter seeped into the lungs, causing them to fill with fluid until the victim could no longer breathe. This disease took advantage of weakened bodies, particularly those already suffering from hunger or of their ailments. In crowded living spaces, where air was often stale and the walls leaky, pneumonia spread rapidly, claiming the lives of entire families. It wasn't uncommon for one member of a household to succumb to this illness, followed shortly by others, leaving behind broken families and countless orphaned children. Even royalty wasn't safe from the ravages of winter sickness. Castles, though grand, were not immune to disease. The constant flow of people, visitors, dignitaries and servants meant that illness could travel quickly from one place to another. A guest arriving with an illness could inadvertently bring pestilence to the court with deadly consequences. Henry VIII, for instance, lost his beloved wife Jane Seymour to complications following childbirth, complications that were likely worsened by the poor hygiene practices of the time. Disease didn't care for status or rank. It was a cruel and indifferent force that struck wherever it could. Children, perhaps, were the most vulnerable of all. The combination of harsh weather, inadequate nutrition, and unsanitary conditions made winter a particularly perilous season for young ones. Infants born during the colder months had an especially difficult start in life, facing the risks of both exposure to the elements and illness. In 16th century London, it was said that half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. This heartbreaking statistic reflects the vulnerability of the young in an era where survival was never guaranteed. One haunting practice from the time speaks volumes about the dangers children faced. The custom of bone lace, where a black ribbon was tied to the hand of a seriously ill infant. If the child died, the ribbon would be used to tie their burial shroud. A grim reminder of how precarious life could be for the most innocent. With dangers lurking both outside and within, winter became a time to hunker down and pray for survival. For those of limited means, even the basic comforts of food, warmth, and shelter were hard to come by. The poverty of winter was a constant companion, with each day a fight to stave off the cold and hunger. Firewood was precious and expensive, and strict laws governed the collection of fallen timber from the forests. A peasant family might gather around a small fire made from dried dung and straw, desperately trying to ward off the chill in their humble abode. Livestock huddled close to the fire, their breath rising in clouds of steam as they sought any warmth they could find. Food was another constant worry. With the harvest long gone, supplies dwindled to a meagre diet of salted meat, dried peas, and coarse bread. The first flush of spring, when fresh greens would appear, was still months away. For many, the only fresh food available was what could be foraged from the frozen landscape: nettles, garlic, and mushrooms. The scarcity of vegetables made the winter diet monotonous, and dinner pots often contained nothing more than a bland pottage of peas, beans, salted pork, and perhaps a few foraged greens or wild onions for flavour. The meals were simple, tasteless, and far from nourishing, but they were enough to keep body and soul together until the arrival of spring. However, for many, even this meagre food was out of reach. Storms, droughts, pests, and other calamities could ruin crops and create widespread food shortages, throwing entire regions into crisis. The Great Famine of 1315 was one of the most devastating events in medieval history, caused by heavy rains that rotted crops and made them inedible across much of northern Europe. Contemporary accounts from the time describe desperate people resorting to eating anything they could find, even dogs, horses, and in some extreme cases, human flesh. In the most harrowing cases, parents were said to have smothered their children out of mercy, unable to watch them subsist starve to death. Streets and fields were littered with bodies, too many to bury properly, marking one of the darkest periods in medieval history. While this famine was particularly severe, crop failures and food shortages were a constant threat, with each winter representing a tightrope walk between survival and starvation. Beyond the struggle for survival, winter affected every aspect of medieval culture. Leisure, religion, and even crime and punishment took on the unmistakable mark of the season. The sheer drudgery of daily life in the bitter cold coloured everything from work to recreation. Socially, winter was a time for drawing closer, for relying on the bonds of family and community to get through the long dark days. With travel dangerous and daylight scarce, people turned inward, finding entertainment and solace in the confines of their homes. Storytelling, singing and music helped pass the hours. The flickering light of rushlights or tallow candles illuminated scenes of sewing, weaving and whittling, with industriousness being more necessity than virtue. With idle hands seen as the devil's playground, staying busy was a way to keep both the body and mind occupied. For the literate few, winter offered a rare opportunity to read, but books were an expensive luxury, and only the wealthiest could afford illuminated manuscripts or lavishly bound volumes. Many tradesmen, however, might have a humble library that consisted of a Bible, a book of hours, and perhaps some light reading like tales of Robin Hood. For the fortunate few who had access to reading material, the evenings were often spent reading aloud, entertaining the household with stories of knights, tricksters, and epic adventures. King Arthur's legendary tales were perennial favourites, offering listeners a chance to escape the cold and immerse themselves in the heroic world of chivalry. Less wholesome pastime also helped to pass the time. Dice and gambling were popular ways to spend the winter evenings, although they often led to heated arguments and empty pockets. The clattering of knucklebones and the rattle of dice could be heard in taverns and great halls as fortunes were won and lost. Alcohol was another common winter diversion, with ale, mead and wine providing both warmth and a temporary boost to the spirits. Drinking and socialising helped people forget, if only for a time, the harshness of their daily lives, offering a brief respite from the crushing cold and scarcity. Public houses in medieval Europe saw a surge in activity during the long winter months, offering warmth, companionship and a welcome escape from the bitter cold. Inside the taverns, the atmosphere was alive with laughter, song and debate. Inebriation often led to looser tongues and lower inhibitions, sparking spirited discussions, bawdy songs, and occasionally even a brawl or two. For a brief time, these gatherings provided a release from the weight of the world, where people could momentarily forget their troubles and immerse themselves in the camaraderie of others. But winter was not only a time for merriment. The long, dark days also provided ample opportunity for quiet reflection and spiritual contemplation. The church held great influence over medieval life, and winter became a season for drawing closer to God. With the agricultural work slowed or paused, there was more time to devote to prayer, penance, and acts of kindness. Christmas festivities, including nativity plays and pageants, gave way to more sombre religious observances. As winter deepened, many people embarked on pilgrimages to holy sites, braving the harsh conditions as a display of their faith and commitment. Others found solace in the stillness of the church, where they could sit in prayer, their numb fingers wrapped around rosary beads, meditating on their eternal souls. Charity, too, was a central theme of winter, with almsgiving seen as a Christian duty. The 7 acts of corporal mercy outlined a clear framework for generosity: feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, sheltering the homeless, clothing the naked, visiting prisoners, comforting the sick, and burying the dead. In a time of scarcity, these acts of compassion became more than mere duty. They were lifelines. The simple gesture of sharing what little one had could be the difference between life and death. Yet even amid such compassion, winter's harshness often brought out the worst in people. Desperation led to an increase in crime, and opportunities for theft were more abundant in the bitter months. With more people confined indoors for longer periods, tempers often frayed, resulting in a rise in assaults and violent crimes. The medieval justice system, already overwhelmed, struggled to handle the surge in lawlessness. Trials were often delayed until the weather improved, leaving the accused to languish in overcrowded jails. Punishments for crimes could be severe, ranging from fines to floggings, and in extreme cases, executions. Despite these grim realities, the human spirit endured. People found small joys and moments of lightness where they could. The promise of spring, no matter how distant, provided hope and kept them going through the darkest nights. In February, the days began to lengthen, and with it came the cheerful celebration of St. Valentine's Day on the 14th. Originally a pagan fertility rite, this day had been Christianized into a celebration of love. It became a bright spot in the heart of winter, a time for warmth and affection amid the cold. By the 15th century, the tradition of drawing names for Valentine's sweethearts was well established. Young men and women would gather to draw slips of paper, sealing their romantic fate for the upcoming year. These pairings often led to playful flirtations, and in some cases, even marriages. Flowers, sweets, and sentimental verses were exchanged as tokens of affection, and the simple act of receiving a handmade card could set hearts aflame, even in the coldest of winters. However, as St. Valentine's Day passed and Lent approached, the mood shifted once again. The austerity of the season deepened, and the promise of spring felt just out of reach. But even as winter lingered, there were signs that the worst was behind them. Snowdrops and crocuses began to poke their fragile heads through the frost, signalling that winter's icy grip was beginning to loosen. The cycle of seasons in the Middle Ages, though relentless, was marked by an unwavering hope for renewal. Winter was a season of hardship where survival was often the greatest accomplishment, and yet it was also a time of incredible resilience and quiet strength. Medieval winter was a test of character, a proving ground for the values of faith, family, and community. While the icicles glistened in the weak sun, and the frosty meadows stretched out before them, the reality of winter in medieval Europe was anything but picturesque. Yet this crucible of snow, ice, and scarcity forged a people of remarkable grit and endurance. The Middle Ages were built on the perseverance of those who could weather the harshest winters and still find reasons to hope for spring. So next time you find yourself grumbling about a delayed train or a slushy sidewalk, think back to your medieval ancestors. They had no thermal socks, no central heating, and no weather apps, yet they faced winter head-on, each year, as a battle to be fought with every available resource. And time and again they emerged victorious, as spring would always come. We are the heirs to their tenacity, their strength, and their unbreakable spirit. As we settle into our warm beds under electric blankets, with our heated homes and comfortable lives, let us spare a thought for those who came before us. They fought winter's bitter siege with nothing but willpower, community, and hope. When the weak winter sun struggled to pierce the leaden clouds, the people of medieval Europe pulled their meagre cloaks tighter, bracing against the cold. For the poorest peasants, their ragged woolen garments, which were stifling and uncomfortable during the summer months, now offered scarcely more protection than a thin veil against winter's icy blast. They huddled together in their small, smoky homes, thankful for the weak warmth that their fires provided, their breath visible in the frosty air. Even the animals felt the cold's bite. An elderly draught horse, ribs visible beneath its shaggy coat, longed for the lush grass of summer. The milk cow huddled in the barn shivered as cold air cut through the walls. Even the barn cats, usually aloof and disdainful, looked less haughty as they too felt the gnawing hunger and the sting of winter on their whiskers. Winter was a particularly challenging time for the lower rungs of medieval society, but even those who lived in grand, draughty castles weren't immune to the hardships of the season. Many a noblewoman, draped in her finest silk gowns, would despair when her clothes proved useless against the damp chill of cold stone walls. The royal kitchens worked tirelessly, attempting to create enough warm delicacies to satisfy their noble guests, but it often felt like an impossible task. There's a tale of King Henry II of England, who, shivering terribly from the cold, was said to have burned an entire chair just to warm his royal backside for a few blessed moments. His servants, aware of his fiery temper, knew that he would be in an even fouler mood if he remained cold for too long. For peasants and kings alike, winter felt like an endless slog, a never-ending battle against the cold with only brief moments of respite. The most anticipated of these moments was often the Feast of St. Stephen, held on December 26th. This celebration was a rare island of indulgence and joy in the otherwise harsh winter months. For one day, a peasant was crowned the Lord of Misrule and given the authority to oversee the festivities. This subversion of the social order allowed for a brief but delightful rebellion against the rigid class system. Imagine the laughter that must have echoed through the halls as the lowest serf ordered a local baron around with mock imperiousness. For one day the rules of society dissolved, and everyone could revel together as equals. Though the feast was short-lived, it provided a much-needed break from the heavy burden of winter. The mirth and joy brought by the celebration were a temporary reprieve from the harshness of the season. But once the festivities ended, the cold reality of winter set in again. People returned to their hearths and their work, and the battle against winter's icy grip resumed. Yet even in the bleakest depths of winter, there were moments of compassion that warmed the coldest hearts. Neighbours shared what little they had with each other, displaying kindness and generosity that no frost could diminish. There's a touching story of Dame Matilda of York, who once gave her only cloak to a beggar woman, despite the fact that she herself had to endure the walk home in the biting cold. When asked why she would give away her only protection against the chill, she simply smiled and said, "The warmth of human kindness is a fire that never goes out." Acts of selflessness like these were the secret weapon medieval people used to combat the relentless cold. Though winter could freeze their limbs, it could not touch the warmth of their hearts. And so they endured. They persisted. With each passing day, their courage and generosity fueled them through the harshest months. The first green buds of spring were not just a sign of warmer weather, they were a living testament to the strength of the human spirit. The indomitable will to survive, to rise again after each winter, was the very foundation of their existence. The medieval people's ability to withstand the worst the season could throw at them and still find joy in the simplest of things is a legacy we carry with us today. As we curl up in the warmth of our homes, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by modern comforts, we might do well to remember the trials of those who came before us. Our medieval ancestors faced winter with nothing but their courage, their communities and their unbreakable spirits. They fought each year's winter battle with little more than a cloak and a fierce determination to make it through. And against all odds, they triumphed. The long-awaited arrival of spring was a cause for celebration in medieval Europe. After enduring months of brutal cold, people looked eagerly toward the warmer days ahead. They had spent the winter huddled in cramped quarters, eating meagre rations, and bracing against the biting chill. But now, as the days slowly grew longer and the sun's rays began to melt the snow, there was a renewed sense of hope. The earth, dormant under the thick blanket of frost, was stirring once again. Children long confined indoors eagerly dashed out into the fresh air. The feeling of spring breezes on their faces was a delight after the sting of winter winds. They raced through the wet mud, laughing as they spotted the first crocuses poking through the thawing ground. In the fields, farmers eagerly awaited Plough Monday, the official start of the agricultural year. It occurred on the first Monday after Epiphany, when the ground had softened enough for ploughing. Draft horses and oxen were harnessed to ploughs and paraded through the village, adorned in colourful ribbons and garlands. The sounds of church bells ringing joyfully marked the beginning of the new growing season, filling the air with hope and renewal. As the chimneys began to smoke again, a sign of life returning to the hearths, the threat of frostbite and illness receded with the snowbanks. Faces, once lined with worry and exhaustion, now brightened with smiles of relief. The prospect of fresh food, fruits and vegetables, a welcome change from the bland salted meats and hard cheeses that had sustained them through the long dark months, was a joy that could not be overstated. The arrival of spring was not just a shift in the seasons, but a profound affirmation of life itself. We may find it difficult to understand the magnitude of this seasonal change from our modern perspective, where the challenges of winter are softened by a modern technology. We complain about slushy roads and losing an hour of sleep to daylight savings time. But for our medieval ancestors, the arrival of spring was nothing short of life-affirming. It meant that they had survived another brutal winter, with all its cold, hunger and sickness. The transformation of the land from a stark, frozen wasteland to a lush, fertile paradise was a reflection of their own survival. The return of warmth was not just a relief for the body, but for the spirit as well. The joy of spring's return can still be heard echoing through the ages in lively medieval songs and verses that celebrate the season's arrival. One such English tune joyously declared, "Loudly sing, cuckoo, the seed is growing, the meadow is blooming, and the wood is springing up anew. Sing, cuckoo." This simple yet powerful rhyme exudes a kind of irrepressible joy, as if the very earth itself is singing in celebration. The exuberance is palpable, and it reminds us of the immense fortitude, resilience, and zest for life embodied by our medieval ancestors. Through the harshest conditions they endured, scraping through each winter with nothing but grit, determination, and the strength of their communities. When the spring sun finally pierced winter's oppressive silence and birdsongs once again filled the air, they didn't just feel relief, they revelled in the triumph of having survived. It was a victory, and one to be celebrated. As we snuggle into our warm beds today, perhaps grumbling about the chill outside our windows, we should pause and remember those long-ago souls who lived through such adversity. Imagine them throwing open their shutters to let the first breath of spring air rush in, shaking off the shackles of winter and stepping out into the world with a heart full of joy. They met the brutal realities of winter with a tenacity and exuberant will to live that should humble us all. Let their strength remind us when we face our own bleak seasons, whether literal or metaphorical. If they could emerge from the depths of winter with such joy, then surely we too can find the well springs of hope to sustain us. Spring would eventually come, the sun would return, and we, like them, would step out into the light once more. Their voices join with ours as we too sing in our hearts. Sing cuckoo. But even as the snow began to melt, winter's bitterness didn't release its hold so easily. The cold winds, blizzards, and frost still tormented the land. Yet the medieval people possessed a stubborn resilience that allowed them to face even the darkest winters with determination. They found ways to help one another endure the season's cruelty, forming a community of mutual support. Neighbours shared what little food they had, taking turns hosting communal meals to ensure no one went hungry. Young men were often assigned to check on elderly widows, bringing firewood and repairing their homes. One such widow, Agnes, was all alone, her body aching from the cold. Her hands shook as she tried to start a fire, but the damp wood wouldn't catch. Just when she thought she could take no more, there was a knock at her door. It was Tom, a strong young lad from the village, cheeks rosy from the biting wind. He didn't just bring firewood, he also carried a sack of dried peas and a chunk of salted pork, gifts from other villagers. Tears of gratitude ran down Agnes's wrinkled face as Tom stoked a fire that filled her small cottage with warmth for the first time in weeks. Such acts of kindness were common during these harsh times, and they provided not just physical warmth, but a much-needed sense of solidarity. Even the wealthy and noble families did their part. Lady Margaret, the wife of a local earl, was known for her charity during winter. While her castle's larder was well stocked, she insisted on sending wagons of grain and preserved food to the poorest peasants in her husband's domain. Some of her highborn peers scoffed at this, viewing the peasants as little more than cattle, but Lady Margaret held firm to her Christian duty to help those less fortunate. One particularly brutal winter, famine ravaged the region. Lady Margaret worked tirelessly to stretch her castle's provisions, ordering the cooks to prepare hearty soups and stews to distribute to the hungry. Though the kitchen boys grumbled at the extra work, the head cook, Bernard, shared her commitment to kindness. He stuffed the soups with every last turnip, potato, and scrap of mutton in the cellar. The peasants, starving and cold, gratefully slurped down the broth. For many, it would be their only meal for days. As the days wore on, even Lady Margaret's resources began to dwindle. She quietly sold some of her jewellery and finery to buy more food from neighbouring towns. Her husband, the Earl, chose to look the other way, respecting her piety even as he worried about the strain it put on their own supplies. The church also played its part in helping the suffering. Monasteries opened their doors to the poor and the sick, offering them a place to sleep and a simple meal of bread and ale. Some monasteries even ran rudimentary hospitals to tend to the frostbitten and the ill. The monks, following Christ's example, believed it was their holy duty to care for the most vulnerable in society. One young monk, Brother William, worked in the monastery's infirmary, tending to the sick. Though the sight and smell of disease sickened him, he continued his work, feeding broth to toothless elders and changing the filthy bandages of open sores. He prayed for strength to endure, knowing that his own station in life spared him from the worst ravages of winter. For winter was the great equalizer. It laid low the rich and poor alike with its icy scythe. Even the nobility, who could afford thick woolen clothing and hot mulled wine, still shivered in their draughty castles, worrying about dwindling stores of food. One such noblewoman, Lady Isabel, was heavily pregnant during a particularly brutal cold snap. She was kept in the warmth of her confinement chamber, surrounded by furs and attended to by maids. Though her chambers were heated, and she had every comfort, the winter still found its way in. One of the kitchen girls, coughing heavily, brought her a warm pot of milk and herbs. Within days, Lady Isabel was burning with fever, her lungs rattling. Her baby was born too soon, a tiny fragile thing that never took its first breath. This story serves as another harsh reminder that winter's cruelty knew no boundaries. It claimed even those living in the greatest comfort. But it also highlights the resilience and compassion that defined medieval society, a testament to their ability to help one another through the worst of times. By the week's end, Lady Isabel too had succumbed to the harsh winter. Even the king was not immune. Henry V, a pious and gentle soul, worried endlessly about the suffering of his subjects during the dreadful winter of 1433. The royal physicians recommended a tonic made from cinnamon and ginger to ward off the cold humours, but still he sank into deep melancholy, unable to warm his hands even when placed in front of the roaring hearth. Some whispered it was God's punishment for Henry's perceived weaknesses as a ruler, but in truth the misery of winter could afflict anyone, no matter their station. Seasonal, depression, though often overlooked, could strike even the mightiest king or the humblest serf. As the days slowly began to lengthen, and the clenched fist of winter finally began to loosen, people allowed themselves to dream of spring. They prayed for the land to thaw, for the first tentative buds to appear on the skeletal trees, signalling the beginning of the agricultural year. On the first Monday after Epiphany, medieval communities celebrated Plough Monday. It was a time when the first symbolic furrow would be ploughed into the frost-covered earth, a hopeful sign of the crops to come. Men would blacken their faces with soot for luck and parade through the muddy lanes, singing boisterous songs to wake the dormant soil. The festivities didn't end there. There was dancing, hearty food, and plenty of ale to go around. It was a promise, a covenant that the dark days of winter were behind them and that brighter days lay ahead. This seasonal shift was felt at all levels of society. In the great halls of dukes and countesses, minstrels played merry tunes while couples danced with the optimism of a new year. The king hosted lavish feasts for his court, with tables overflowing with delicacies like roast swan and marzipan sweets. Even the lowly peasant Giles, with his humble family, felt the weight of winter lift from his shoulders as he ventured out to his plot of land. He clutched a pouch of precious save seeds, seeds that meant a future filled with full bellies. Agnes, the widow who had barely survived the harsh winter, found herself stirring a pot of pottage, humming softly in relief. She had made it through winter's gauntlet to see another spring dawn. Praise be to God. Winter was brutal, and there's no denying its cruelty. It brought hunger, bone-chilling cold, and the constant spectre of death and disease. But in the face of it all, the true resilience and communal spirit of medieval society shone through. When staring into the abyss of winter's bleakness, people responded with generosity, grit, and even moments of defiant celebration. They understood that winter was an unavoidable part of the natural cycle, and the best way to overcome its challenges was by hunkering down and enduring together. As we curl up under our cosy duvets today, perhaps grumbling about the high heating bills or scraping a bit of frost from our windshields, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on how our medieval ancestors faced their winters. Without electric blankets, central heating, or grocery deliveries, they endured winter after winter in conditions we can hardly imagine. While our modern winter woes may seem all-consuming at the moment, they pale in comparison to the harsh realities our ancestors faced. We might even learn something from their experience. Empathy, charity, and an irrepressible hope for spring were their tools for surviving life's hardships. Whether facing a polar vortex or a pandemic, their strength and resilience can inspire us to embrace the coming of spring with full hearts, knowing that whatever storms we face, the sun will eventually return. The harshness of winter makes the blossoming of spring all the more beautiful. As a medieval king might say, "Let us winter bravely so that we may spring eternally." You can almost feel the frost underfoot as you trudge through the snowdrifts, breath clouding in the icy air. Icicles glitter in the weak sunlight, hanging from the eaves of wooden huts. The village lies hushed and still, bracing against winter's relentless onslaught. This was winter for most of our medieval ancestors, not the cosy scenes of feasts in warm castles surrounded by music and laughter that we might imagine. For the vast majority, winter was a time of brutal cold, gnawing hunger, and grim survival. The spectre of hunger loomed large during the winter months. With crops withered and livestock scarce, finding food was an everyday battle. Grain stores dwindled, and all that remained were bitter herbs, dried turnips, and whatever could be foraged from the frozen earth. One particularly harsh winter in 1315, a man's harvest fell short by a third due to storms and freezing weather. Desperate peasants were forced to eat the straw from their roofs and boil the leather from their shoes to survive, yet they still had to labour for their lords. Malnutrition weakened the body's defences, making medieval folk more susceptible to illness. The common cold could quickly escalate into life-threatening pneumonia or bronchitis. Influenza cut through villages like a scythe, claiming the lives of both the young and old. Huddling together for warmth, people crammed into their homes, packed with family members, livestock, and sometimes even the local dogs and chickens. The air inside was thick with the stale smoke from their fires, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the stench of filthy chamber pots. It was an environment ripe for disease. In one 14th century Suffolk household, 13 family members, ranging from the elderly to infants, along with their malnourished pets, huddled together in a single small smokehouse. It's incredible that any of them survived until spring. But disease wasn't the only threat lurking in the darkness. Fires were a constant danger in the packed wooden towns and villages. One small spark could quickly spread, devouring entire neighbourhoods and leaving nothing but ash in its wake. The Great Fire of London in 1212 serves as a grim reminder of winter's potential for devastation. On a cold November night, a spark ignited the city's narrow, cramped lanes, and the flames spread quickly. With water frozen in the pipes and the harsh winter making firefighting efforts almost impossible, an estimated 3,000 Londoners perished in the inferno. Many more were left homeless, vulnerable to the biting cold that gripped the city in winter's icy embrace. Travel in these frigid months was a perilous affair. The roads turned into muddy quagmires that were nearly impossible to navigate, and snowstorms often blurred the path, leaving travellers lost and disoriented. Daylight, already scarce in winter, shortened further, making it easy for the weary to lose their way in the frozen wilderness. In 1311, Queen Isabella of England set out from Canterbury to London as twilight deepened. Her party became hopelessly lost in the dark and freezing cold, wandering for hours while the pregnant queen wept in fear and exhaustion. The cruel winter was just as merciless to working animals. Horses and oxen, vital for transport and labour, grew gaunt and weak from poor winter feed. Their laboured breaths smoked in the icy air as they hauled carts and logs through knee-deep snow, enduring frostbite and cracked hooves. The wheels of carts groaned under the strain, and the animals' suffering mirrored that of the people. Yet even amidst this harshness, small moments of light persisted. The feast of St. Stephen, known today as Boxing Day, was a time for charity and goodwill. Alms boxes in churches were filled with donations for the poor, and lords provided hearty meals for their tenants. The tradition of the Lord of Misrule brought a spark of festivity to the darkest days of winter. On this day, a humble peasant or jester would be crowned as the king and given the authority to preside over revelry and mischief. This temporary subversion of the social order allowed for a much-needed release of pent-up frustrations, providing a brief but welcome respite from the rigid hierarchies of medieval life. Despite the privations and dangers, hope endured in the hearts of medieval people. Hope that the weak would survive, that food would last until spring, and that the relentless cold would soon be replaced by the warmth of the sun. So when you find yourself grumbling about shoveling snow, cursing the thermostat, or waiting for the bus in the chill, spare a thought for the medieval souls who faced these same struggles, and then some. They survived winter after the winter with few of the comforts we take for granted today. Their quiet courage in the face of winter's brutality offers a profound lesson. Empathy, charity, and an unwavering hope for spring are the best ways to endure life's hardships. Whether facing a polar vortex or a pandemic, we can draw strength from their example, knowing that, like them, brighter days will come. Winter's icy grip eventually loosened, and with it came the first signs of spring. The landscape transformed into a crystalline wonderland, though the beauty was tempered by the immense hardship it had caused. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the countryside in a suffocating shroud. Icicles hung from the eaves of homes and castles alike, shimmering like daggers. Inside, the warmth of the hearth provided fleeting comfort, and the smoke that poured from the flames choked the air, stinging eyes and lungs alike. People and livestock crowded together in small spaces, sharing the warmth of the fire as they endured the chill. The pungent smells of dung, unwashed bodies, and the smoke from the fire created a distinctly medieval winter scent that filled the air. For some, even this limited warmth was a luxury they could barely afford. The poorest families scraped by on meagre food stores, with hunger gnawing at their bellies. Many of the poorest subsisted on nothing more than coarse bread and thin gruel, hoping they could survive until the first fruits of spring. The spectre of famine hovered over every household, from the lowliest peasant to the highest lord. No one, it seemed, was immune from winter's deadly grasp. Even the nobility, tucked away in their cold stone castles, weren't safe from winter's cruelty. The castles, while grand, were often poorly insulated, their draughty halls allowing the cold to seep in. Rulers, though draped in furs, still shivered beneath the weight of winter's chill. The royal households required vast quantities of firewood to see them through the long winter months, and woe to the kingdom whose sovereign failed to prepare adequately. One such tragic tale recounts the death of a Bohemian princess who succumbed to the cold in her bedchamber. Her death, despite her wealth and status, was a chilling reminder that even the rich could not escape the harshness of winter. For a peasant family, the loss of a loved one to winter's icy scythe was an all too frequent occurrence. Disease, too, added to the death toll. Fever and ague spread quickly through communities already weakened by hunger and overcrowding. The stale, smoky air of their homes made it easy for infections to spread, and medieval physicians, relying more on superstition than science, were often powerless to help. In these dire times, death was a constant companion, and the cruel season of winter made it all the more inevitable. The roads, treacherous with snowdrifts and black ice, added to the burdens of the season. Only the desperate or foolhardy would venture far from their homes in the darkest months. Travel was dangerous, and the peddlers' carts that normally carried goods to isolated villages remained idle. Tithes and taxes went uncollected, much to the frustration of lords and clergy, and armies too struggled to maintain their supply lines as they marched across snow-choked roads. One of the most incredible military feats of the medieval winter occurred during the winter of 1407. The Welsh rebel leader, Owen Glendower, faced off against the superior forces of future King Henry V. In the high mountain passes, Glendower's men, accustomed to the harsh conditions, lured the English into a trap amid a blinding snowstorm. The English soldiers, encumbered by their heavy armour, were at a disadvantage. Many perished from the cold, and Glendower's victory, won as much by the winter weather as by his tactical prowess, became legendary. Medieval winters were often marked by devastating famines. The cold months could delay spring planting, and food shortages soon followed. The infamous Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was caused by unusually wet and chilly spring weather, which rotted crops and ruined seedlings. The following 2 years of failed harvests led to widespread starvation. In England, the price of bread skyrocketed, reaching 20 times its normal cost. This period of deprivation left its mark on medieval society, and many communities were forever scarred by the brutal winter of famine and death. The medieval winter was a time of unimaginable hardship, especially for the poor. As food became increasingly scarce, many were driven to desperate measures to survive. People resorted to eating grass, roots, and even the bark off trees. Desperate bands of scavengers dug up graves, cannibalizing the dead to stave off hunger. In cities like Bruges and Antwerp, an estimated 10 to 25% of the population perished during the famine. In the French town of Troyes, one citizen wrote in his diary that the poor were reduced to eating dogs, horses, and any unclean animal they could find. The misery was compounded by rising crime and disease, as malnourished citizens turned to theft and violence in a desperate attempt to survive. A heart-rending account from the St. Mary's Abbey Chronicles tells the tragic fate of a starving woman imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread. Pregnant and starving, she had begged the baker for some bread, but he refused. Desperate, she stole a loaf and was caught. The judges refused to pardon her, and she was sentenced to hang. As she died, the infant fell from her womb before the eyes of the onlookers. The child, bloody and screaming, lay on the ground, but no one dared to touch or save it. The baby died where it fell, alone and unloved. This gruesome story encapsulates the stark and brutal reality of life in the Middle Ages, where even the most basic human need could lead to tragic consequences. The famine finally eased in 1318, when the weather improved and crops began to grow again. But the shadow of starvation hung over the land every winter, ready to strike again with even the smallest adversity. For medieval people, winter was a time filled with constant anxiety and fear, as they prayed that their meagre food stores would last until the thaw of spring. Malnutrition weakened the population and made them vulnerable to disease. The close, unsanitary living conditions during winter led to frequent outbreaks of infections, such as influenza, dysentery, and pneumonia. Respiratory illnesses in particular took a heavy toll, spreading quickly through communities weakened by hunger. The close proximity of people in their small, poorly ventilated homes, combined with the smoke from the hearths, created the perfect breeding ground for disease. A simple winter cold could easily turn deadly in such conditions. Even the medical professionals of the time, relying on treatments like bloodletting and harsh purges, could do little to stop the spread of illness. One of the most famous historical figures to succumb to the winter's wrath was Emperor Charlemagne. In 814, Charlemagne, already weakened by age and illness, died after being treated with ineffective remedies, including purges and enemas. His doctors, relying on outdated methods, were unable to save him. This is a sobering reminder that despite their power, even the most influential rulers could fall victim to winter's cruelty. The Black Death of the 14th century, which swept across Europe in 1348 to 1349, further demonstrated the devastating impact of winter on medieval populations. The death toll was staggering, with estimates suggesting that 30 to 60% of Europe's population perished from the plague. Some historians believe that the rapid spread of the disease was fueled by the malnourished citizens who were packed together in small, freezing homes during the winter. Their weakened immune systems offered little resistance to the disease. One poignant letter from Pistoia, Italy, written by a man named Sir Luca to his brother Franceschino, paints a chilling picture of the devastation caused by the plague. "I am sick at heart and can barely bring myself to write, for things here go from bad to worse. Many are dead and many more are dying. Shops are closed, taverns deserted. One passes down streets without meeting a soul. Wails of grief echo from houses where death has struck. The stench of rot rises from mass graves. I fear our city may soon be empty of life entirely. I beg you, stay where you are and pray for us unceasingly." As the plague raged, entire villages were wiped out, and the trauma of mass burials in freezing ground, along with sick people being abandoned in the snow for fear of contagion, compounded the suffering. The impact of the Black Death left deep psychological scars and permanently altered the medieval world. Winter was especially perilous for the elderly, the very young, and expectant mothers. Without modern medicine, these vulnerable populations were particularly prone to succumbing to the harsh cold, disease, or malnutrition. It is estimated that up to 20 to 30% of infants died within their first year of life in some medieval societies, with many of these deaths occurring during the harsh winter months. Pregnancy and childbirth complications, exacerbated by poor diet and cold conditions, claimed the lives of countless mothers and babies. One tragic story is that of Matilda, the 12-year-old daughter of King Henry III of England. In the winter of 1120, Matilda was aboard a ship called the White Ship, travelling from France to England. The ship struck a rock and sank, sending Matilda and the other passengers into the frigid waters of the English Channel. She nearly escaped drowning by getting into a small rescue boat, but when she cried out for her half-brother William, who was still in the water, the boat returned to rescue him. In the chaos, too many people tried to climb aboard, capsizing the boat and throwing Matilda back into the cold sea. She drowned along with her unborn child, and her grief-stricken father was said to have never smiled again for the rest of his life. The elderly and very young were always at risk during medieval winters. Even if they survived the diseases and the famine, they could still freeze to death in their sleep. In the medieval poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there is a chilling depiction of the elderly King Arthur, shivering beneath his robes in a cold, draughty hall, his teeth chattering as he spoke. Without modern insulation, winters in the Middle Ages were often marked by fierce snowstorms and devastating floods. One such flood occurred in 1216, when King John of England lost his crown jewels while crossing a marsh in East Anglia. Fleeing enemies in rebellion, King John's baggage train was swept away by a rising tide, and his treasures, including priceless jewelled crowns and sceptres, disappeared into the floodwaters, never to be seen again. King John died a few days later, reportedly broken-hearted. Some historians speculate that the loss of his crown jewels contributed to his downfall. Coastal communities also suffered from the brutal winter storms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a terrible flood in 1099, when a great sea flood inundated much of England. It was described as the most devastating flood in memory, drowning many towns and causing widespread devastation. Another North Sea flood in 1219 completely submerged the low-lying Netherlands, killing over 50,000 people. These storms were a constant reminder of winter's power to disrupt lives, destroy property, and take countless lives. In an era with no early warning systems or emergency shelters, medieval folk were completely at the mercy of the elements. Theirs was a world where winter came with relentless fury, and all they could do was pray for deliverance as icy floodwaters rose and the wind howled like the very hounds of hell outside their frail homes. In such conditions, life could seem unbearably cruel, and winter, with its cold, its storms and its diseases, was the most formidable enemy. Yet even in the darkest depths of winter, the people found ways to endure. One such hardship came in the form of fire. As the cold drove people to seek warmth at any cost, fires became more frequent, sometimes with tragic consequences. In 1132, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts a dreadful fire on London Bridge. The blaze spread so rapidly that it consumed a large portion of the city, including the principal church of St. Paul and the Cathedral of Canterbury, along with countless homes and smaller churches. The powerful winds drove the flames, carrying burning rafters and molten lead across great distances. Medieval buildings, mostly made of timber and tightly packed together, turned. Cities into giant tinderboxes. A stray spark or overturned candle could quickly turn a city block into an inferno, particularly when strong winter winds fanned the flames. As the fire raged, people fled through narrow streets, often with little more than the clothes on their backs. Many were tragically separated, with families torn apart in the chaos, children trampled, and people trapped and burned alive. The firefighting methods of the time were rudimentary, limited to throwing water or snow on the flames, praying that the wind would change direction before the entire city was consumed. In the end, the destruction was often near total, leaving thousands homeless and destitute, forced to face the bitter winter without shelter. Perhaps the greatest peril of medieval winter, however, was not the fires or the floods, but the sheer, life-sapping cold itself. In our modern world, it's hard to imagine the extent of the suffering caused by the winter cold. With no central heating, no thermal fabrics, and no modern insulation, medieval people faced a constant battle against the bitter damp and the unrelenting chill. Smoky fires and piles of furs offered a temporary respite, but the cold sank deep into the bones, leaving people weary and vulnerable. Arthritis and rheumatism were common afflictions, and for many the pain worsened as the seasons passed. Extremities grew numb and in the worst cases blackened with frostbite. Pneumonia and influenza ran rampant, especially in the close, unsanitary quarters where families and animals alike huddled together for warmth. The cold seemed to reach into the very soul, sapping strength and vitality, and even a simple winter cold could quickly escalate into a life-threatening illness. The British monk Gildas, writing in the 6th century, painted a grim picture of the winter conditions in his work on the fall of Britain. The nights are long and dark, the days dreary and chill. The air bites with malice, the icy blasts cut to the bone. All is blanketed in snow and frost. It is a time of great suffering for man and beast alike, when all the earth seems dead and frozen, locked in the clutches of a frigid hell. For the elderly and frail, winter was a time of particular dread. The hopeless feeling that warmth might never return was a constant companion. People piled on as many layers of clothing as they could find, huddled together for warmth, but still the cold crept in. Fires sputtered and died in the damp, leaving only thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and choked the throat. The sound of coughing echoed in the dark, a reminder of how widespread and constant the struggle was. Even the young and healthy, when forced to spend weeks enduring the cold, moved sluggishly, as if the cold itself was weighing them down. There was no escape from winter's grip. There were no cosy electric blankets or warm vacations to look forward to. The cold was an omnipresent force, sapping strength and energy and making survival an ongoing challenge. It's no wonder that in medieval society the passage of time was often measured by winters survived rather than years or months. Making it through to another spring was a victory, a triumph over nature's cruelty that grew more difficult with each passing season. Yet somehow, despite the crushing cold, the hunger, and the deadly diseases, the people of the Middle Ages endured. Year after year, winter after brutal winter, they pressed on. They tightened their belts when the last scraps of food were gone. They wrapped themselves in, tattered blankets when the fire burned low, and when the darkness and cold threatened to break their spirits, they huddled together and whispered stories of brighter days to come. A passage from the 14th century English poem Piers Plowman beautifully captures the resilience of the medieval people. It reads, "Through woe and winter's bale, frost and snow and sleet and hail, all shall pass and peace prevail. Hope shall triumph and never fail." Even in the darkest depths of winter, medieval people found moments of joy and grace. They came together to sing and pray, sharing what little they had with others. In the howling winds, some swore they could hear angels' voices, whispering that warmth and light would come again. The medieval spirit held fast to hope. Even in the harshest of winters, they knew that the sun would eventually return. They clung to the belief that no matter how unrelenting the cold, spring would come, and with it, a new beginning. The world would be reborn, as green and glorious as if winter had never been. The winters of the Middle Ages were brutal, merciless, long, and seemingly endless. They brought hunger, disease, destruction, and death. But they also brought out the best in the human spirit, the unshakable will to survive, the determination to endure, and the unyielding hope for better days ahead carried the people through even the darkest of times. Through sheer will and communal strength, they survived winters that would have broken lesser people. And from that resilience, we inherit the legacy of their strength and their unwavering belief in the promise of spring. The medieval world was tempered in winter's icy crucible, emerging from it stronger, a little tougher, a little wiser, with a deep appreciation for the turning of the seasons. Perhaps there's something to be learned from our medieval forebears as we grumble about scraping a few inches of frost off our windshields. For them, winter was a matter of life and death, a season to be survived with gritted teeth and unshakable resolve, and survive they did, passing down their tales of winter's wrath and the invincible power of the human spirit. In the heart of our modern winters, as we sit by our heated homes, may we remember their fortitude and find in it the inspiration to shoulder through our own dark days. The people of the Middle Ages stared winter full in the face, refusing to yield. They endured floods and famine, blizzards and the blackest nights. They buried their dead in frozen ground and awoke to the groans of the starving. But always, always, they held fast to the promise of spring. If they could make it through winter after winter, armed with little more than faith and furs, then surely we can find the strength to face our own battles, knowing that the thaw will come and light will return. The brutal winters of the medieval world may be long past, but their lessons echo through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Let us walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, meeting winter's chill with courage, compassion, and unshakable hope. If they could brave the darkest season with heads unbowed, then so too can we. Winter is coming, but spring, as the medieval world knew so well, is never far behind. As the chilling winds howled across the frozen landscape, medieval folk gathered around the flickering hearth fires. Huddled together for warmth, they shared stories of winters past, those harsh and unforgiving seasons that tested the mettle of even the hardiest souls. Whether in humble cottages or grand manor houses, the sting of winter's icy breath knew no bounds. Draughty shutters and thin thatched roofs offered scant protection against the relentless cold. From peasants to princes, all felt the bite of Jack Fiac frost, nipping at their noses and numbing their extremities. But some were fortunate enough to have a roaring hearth around which to cluster. The crackle of the flames and the aroma of wood smoke offered small comfort against winter's onslaught. In the castles of the highborn, great hall fireplaces consumed prodigious amounts of firewood, tended to by servants who never stopped working. Yet even the mightiest noble shuddered at the thought of venturing beyond the warmth of the fire. Winter's chill had a way of penetrating even the thickest stone walls and the richest furs. For those of low birth, the season brought an especially grim and arduous struggle for survival. Their rough hovels offered little in the way of creature comforts. Meagre rations of peas or wood scavenged from the forest barely fed the sputtering hearth. Families crowded together in squalid quarters, sharing body heat and breathing in the smoky air, thick with the stench of unwashed humanity. It was a bleak existence, no doubt. And yet, even in the face of such privations, there were moments of cheer. The glow of communal fires in the village square drew people out of their hovels, if only for a short reprieve. Gathered around the leaping flames, neighbours exchanged jests and stories. For a fleeting time, the cruel realities of winter seemed distant. Young lovers stole secret kisses, their affection undimmed by the cold. Children shrieked with delight as they slid and skated across frozen ponds. Even the elderly felt the weight of their years lift for a spell, transported back to the carefree winters of their youth. These moments of merriment were all the more precious for their rarity. But soon enough, thoughts turned to empty bellies and the gnawing hunger that was the constant companion of the poor. Dreams of spring's bounty seemed a cruel mockery, as fields lay barren beneath a blanket of snow. The spectre of famine loomed large, and a failed harvest could spell doom for entire villages. Many a mother watched in anguish as her child's cheeks grew gaunt, and their eyes dull with the hollow stare of starvation. The cruel calculus of scarcity bred desperation. Stories of depraved acts in the pursuit of food haunted the nightmares of the pious. Hunger was not the only scourge stalking the land. Winter's icy breath also brought a host of illnesses that preyed upon the weakened populace. Pneumonia's hacking cough echoed through many a hovel as loved ones looked on helplessly. The pox and flux raged unchecked, decimating entire families. The very young and the elderly were especially vulnerable, their frail bodies ill-equipped to withstand winter's ravages. But perhaps the greatest cruelty was reserved for those who had to venture out into the teeth of winter's fury. Travellers risked life and limb on treacherous ice-laced roads, many meeting their doom in swirling blizzards or deep snowdrifts. The frozen bodies of the lost would not be discovered until the spring thaw, a grim reminder of winter's lethal power. Even the valiant knights, those stout warriors of the realm, were not immune to winter's depredations. Clad in heavy armour, they became easy prey for the bone-chilling cold. Numb hands, clumsy with frozen gauntlets, struggled to wield sword and shield. Once mighty charges foundered in deep snowdrifts as icicles formed on their heaving flanks. Great and small alike cursed winter. In the halls of power, the weight of the crown pressed heavily on royal brows, furrowed with care. The medieval world was tempered in winter's icy crucible, and emerged from it stronger, tougher, wiser, with a deep, bone-deep appreciation for the turning of the seasons. Perhaps there's a lesson we can draw from our medieval forebears as we grumble about scraping frost off our windshields. For them, winter was a matter of life and death, a season to be survived with grit and unshakable resolve. And survive they did, passing down their tales of winter's wrath and the invincible power of the human spirit. In the dead of our modern winters, as we sit comfortably in our warm homes, may we remember their fortitude and draw inspiration from it to shoulder through our own dark days. The people of the Middle Ages stared winter full in the face and refused to yield. They endured floods, famine, blizzards, and the blackest nights. They buried their dead in frozen ground and woke to the groans of the starving. But always, always they held fast to the promise of spring. If they could make it through winter after winter with little more than faith and furs, then surely we too can find the strength to face our own battles, knowing that the thaw will come and light will return. The brutal winters of the medieval world may be long past, but their lessons still echo through the ages. They stand as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Let us walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, meeting winter's chill with courage, compassion, and unshakable hope. If they could brave the darkest season with heads unbowed, then so too can we. Winter is coming, but spring, as the medieval world knew so well, is never far behind. As the chilling winds howled across the frozen landscape, medieval folk gathered around the flickering hearth fires. Huddled together for warmth, they shared tales of winters past, harsh seasons that tested the resilience of even the hardiest souls. Whether in humble cottages or grand manor houses, the sting of winter's icy breath was felt equally. Draughty shutters and thin thatched roofs offered little protection against the relentless cold. From peasants to princes, all felt the bite of Jack Frost nipping at their noses and numbing their extremities. For those fortunate enough to have a roaring hearth, the crackle of flames and the aroma of burning wood provided some comfort. In the castles of the highborn, massive fireplaces consumed large quantities of firewood tended by servants who never stopped working. Yet, even the mightiest nobles shuddered to venture beyond the warmth of the fire. Winter's chill had a way of penetrating even the thickest stone walls and the richest furs. For those of low birth, the season brought an especially grim and arduous struggle for survival. Their rough hovels provided little comfort. Meagre rations of peas, scraps of salted meat and wood scavenged from the forest barely kept the hearth alight. Families crowded together in squalid quarters, sharing body heat and breathing in the smoky air, thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and livestock. It was a bleak existence, no doubt, but even in the face of such privations there were moments of joy to be found. The glow of communal fires in the village square drew people out of their hovels for a short respite. Gathered around the leaping flames, neighbours exchanged jokes, stories and songs. For a fleeting moment, the cruel realities of winter seemed distant. Young lovers stole, secret kisses, their affection undimmed by the cold. Children shrieked with joy as they slid and skated across frozen ponds. Even the elderly felt the weight of their years lift for a spell, transported back to the carefree winters of their youth. These moments of merriment were all the more precious for their rarity. But soon enough, thoughts turned back to empty bellies and the gnawing hunger that was the constant companion of the poor. Dreams of spring's bounty seemed like a cruel mockery as fields lay barren beneath a blanket of snow. The spectre of famine loomed large, and a failed harvest could spell doom for entire villages. Many mothers watched in anguish as their children's cheeks grew gaunt, their eyes dulled with the hollow stare of starvation. The cruel calculus of scarcity bred desperation. Stories of depraved acts to fill hungry bellies haunted the nightmares of the pious. But hunger was not the only scourge stalking the land. Winter's icy breath bred a host of illnesses that preyed upon the weakened populace. Pneumonia's hacking cough echoed through many hovels as loved ones looked on helplessly. The pox and dysentery raged unchecked, decimating entire families. The very old and the very young were the most vulnerable, their frail bodies ill-equipped to withstand winter's ravages. Perhaps the greatest cruelty, though, was reserved for those forced to venture out into the teeth of winter's fury. Travellers risked life and limb on treacherous ice-covered roads. Many hapless wayfarers met their doom, swallowed up by swirling blizzards or plummeting into deep snowdrifts. Their frozen corpses would not be discovered until the spring thaw, a grim reminder of winter's lethal power. Even the valiant knights, those warriors of the realm, were not immune to winter's depredations. Clad in heavy armour, they became easy prey for the bone-chilling cold that crept into every joint and rivet. Numb hands, made clumsy by frozen gauntlets, fumbled with sword and shield. Once mighty chargers faltered in deep snowdrifts, their icicle-covered flanks heaving with exhaustion. The gallant knights cursed the name of winter, as did everyone else. The raucous laughter, the wheezing of reed pipes, and the twanging of fiddles filled the air as medieval folk capered about in a swirling kaleidoscope of colour and mirth. For once, the distinctions between serf and nobleman melted away, as the usual lines of class and station were erased in the spirit of goodwill and camaraderie. The Lord of Misrule, perhaps a young peasant lad with stars in his eyes, took the throne for a day, issuing grandiose proclamations and absurd decrees, much to the delight of the revellers. It must have been a heady thing, that burst of misrule and merriment amid the bleakness. For just a few fleeting hours, they could forget the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, and the bitter isolation of winter, and instead embrace the sheer joy of being alive. But as with all things, the festive season was but a temporary respite, the eye of the storm. Once the Yule log burned down to embers, and the last bowl of ale was drained, the revellers drifted back to their hearths. The darkness of winter settled in once more, a reminder of the harsh days ahead. The gaiety of St. Stephen's Day and the Lord of Misrule's brief reign gave way to the grim business of survival, as winter tightened its icy grip once again. For the next interminable stretch of months, time seemed to slow to a frigid crawl. The land lay frozen and unworkable, and for the rural peasantry there was little to do but hunker down and pray for deliverance. The shortening days and lengthening nights yawned like a vast chasm, and it must have seemed that there was no escape. Huddled together in their crude shelters, the poor souls of the medieval world must have despaired at ever again feeling the warmth of spring's breath upon their faces. But as cruel as winter was, it could not last forever. Beneath the frozen ground, the first green shoots of new life were already straining upwards, biding their time. For those who endured, who clung to hope and to one another through the darkest days and the coldest nights, the thaw would come, the sun would return to the sky, the blood would quicken in their veins, and the world would slowly shed its greys and whites for a burgeoning riot of colour. On Plough Monday, just after Epiphany, the land would again be tilled, and the great wheel of the agricultural year would creak back into motion. The people would emerge blinking into the pale but gathering light of spring, leaner and deeply tired, but alive and glad of it. Fields would be ploughed, seeds planted, flocks driven out to graze on new grass, and the merry dance of life would begin anew. But that, of course, was yet to come. For now the cruel heart of winter beat on, and the people of the Middle Ages steeled themselves once more to weather its icy reign. They drew what comfort they could from their rough woolen cloaks, their smoky hovels, their scant stores of food, those precious supplies they had so diligently hoarded, but most of all from one another. In a world beset by hardship and peril, where the very season seemed intent on crushing the life from their bones, they endured. Together, lords and peasants, young and old, shivering and hoping, they waited beneath the same cruel winter sky for the spring that must someday come, and so they hunkered down in the darkness and the cold, listening to the mournful howl of the wind and the groaning of the ice, spinning tales and weaving dreams to while away the long winter nights. Perhaps they imagined a future where winters were kinder, hearths warmer, bellies fuller. A world their shivering hands and frozen bones might build for the generations to come. Or perhaps they simply clung to what scraps of light and hope they could muster in the moment, knowing that even the longest winter must someday yield to spring. In the face of such brutal conditions, the strength of the human spirit to endure and keep faith in brighter days ahead is truly a marvel. One cannot help but feel a swell of admiration for the fortitude of our medieval forebears, who faced each bitter winter as an indomitable foe and emerged year after year to greet the spring on the other side. Let us then tip our hats to those long ago lords and peasants who suffered much and yet endured still more. In our modern world of central heating and on-demand grocery deliveries, it can be easy to forget the hardships they faced as a matter of course. But as we drift off to sleep in our warm beds, perhaps we can spare a thought for those huddled medieval masses and marvel at the strength that carried them through winter after winter, waiting for the light's return. In a world so often cold and dark, such enduring hope and resilience is a fire that cannot be quenched, burning on from their distant hovels to our own night-swaddled rooms. May we keep that flame alive in our hearts, come what winter may. Of course, no medieval celebration was complete without a hearty feast. On St. Stephen's Day, the Lord of Misrule could demand that the wealthy provide food and drink for the entire community. This charitable gesture not only fostered goodwill, but also created a sense of fellowship among people from all walks of life. Roasted meats, the centrepiece of the feast, took centre stage. Geese, capons, and the ever-popular roast boar's head paraded in with the great fanfare. Minced meat pies, rich with dried fruits and spices, offered a sweet treat, while the wassail bowl flowed freely, the warm spiced cider bolstering everyone's spirits. One can almost hear the laughter and lively chatter ringing through the halls, rising above the blustery winter winds outside. For one brief shining day, the hardships of winter seemed to fade into the background as the community came together in a spirit of joy and camaraderie. As the feast concluded and the revellers dispersed back to their hearths, they carried the warmth of the festivities with them, like a flicker of cheerful firelight in the dark. The knowledge that they had friends and neighbours to rely on, that moments of laughter and levity could still be found even in the bleakest times, surely helped to buoy their spirits for the hard days still ahead. And somehow the winter's icy grip seemed a bit less harsh, the howling winds a bit more bearable, when one had a belly full of good food and a heart full of fellowship. The Feast of St. Stephen was a timely reminder that even the deepest darkness of winter would eventually yield to the first hopeful stirrings of spring. The fragile shoots of new life began to emerge as the winter snow receded, and the frozen ground began to thaw across the countryside. Watchful eyes eagerly scanned for the appearance of snowdrops, those valiant little flowers that poked their fresh green stalks and delicate white blooms through the melting slush. Their arrival heralded the end of winter's long night and the approaching season of rebirth. In villages everywhere, weary folk rejoiced at the first hints of colour and vitality returning to a landscape that had been shrouded in icy white stillness for so many months. With a newfound spring in their steps, medieval peasants returned to the rhythms of the agricultural year, the great wheel of life beginning to turn once more. Hibernating livestock were led out to pastures starting to green again, while farmers hitched their teams to the ploughs, eager to churn the softening earth. The first Monday after Epiphany, falling into January, came to be known as Plough Monday for this very reason. It marked the moment when the land could finally be worked again after the winter freeze, inaugurating the labours of a new farming season. The ploughs that had been stored away for the winter months were hauled out and blessed in joyful processions through the fields, while ploughmen went door to door collecting food, ale, and small coins in anticipation of the work and harvest to come. One can picture a weather-beaten village, faces turned gratefully toward a sky brightening into a paler shade of blue. With hoes and digging sticks in hand, they prepare to sink the first hopeful seeds into the receptive soil, a simple yet profound act of faith that spring would conquer winter in due time. Among them is the wizened old grandmother, a child clutching each gnarled hand as she shows them how to plant peas, just as her own grandmother once taught her, many long springs ago. The smaller child giggles with delight as around. Earthworm wriggles free from the dirt, while the older solemnly pushes each seed into its waiting hollow. It was moments like this, when knowledge passed from old to young, and growth bloomed anew, that made all the privations of winter worthwhile. The warm smile crinkling the grandmother's eyes holds the promise that the dark days have passed, and life is returning to the land once more. As the seeds nestle into their earthen beds and the strengthening sun begins to coax green shoots from the ground, the spectre of winter finally releases its icy hold and slides away. The pall of cold and death that hung for so long is eased by a spirit of hope and renewal carried on spring's gentle breezes. Looking back from our modern vantage point, it's sobering to reflect on the immense fortitude and resilience it must have taken to endure the brutal medieval winters year after year. With none of the amenities and comforts we often take for granted, their very survival through to spring was a feat worthy of admiration. And yet, in the midst of unimaginable hardship, medieval people still managed to find cause for hope, joy and celebration. The warmth of community, the promise of spring, and the restorative power of laughter and fellowship were the lights that guided them through winter's darkest depths. Perhaps, as we snuggle deeper under our cosy comforters, insulated from the cold, we could spare a thought for our long-ago ancestors. The next time the winter wind rattles our windows and we grumble at the chill, we might pause and smile wryly, recognising that our winter woes likely pale in comparison to what they faced year after year, century upon century. And as we drift off to sleep, we can carry the knowledge that we too possess an ember of that same invincible summer that burned in the hearts of medieval folk, the assurance that spring always returns and life goes on, no matter how dark the winter night. So, as the last light fades and the wind whispers a lullaby against the pane, I invite you to let your imagination wander back through the ages to walk alongside those distant ancestors as they triumphed over winter's icy rain. May their courage and indomitable spirit inspire your dreams tonight. And if this journey through history has piqued your curiosity, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are always more warm tales to lull you into restful slumber. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and dream of cosy hearths and fresh green shoots stirring beneath the snow. Good night.